The penthouse door swung open without a sound, and Charlotte Sinclair went perfectly still. A man was kneeling on her marble floor, a cleaning crew member she had never once looked at. But the way he lifted the broken glass, turning it once in the light at exactly the right angle, made her breath catch somewhere in her throat. She had seen that gesture before, years ago. In a conference room where everything fell apart, her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" He looked up, calm, unhurried, almost cold. Just the cleaning crew. But this time she knew he was lying. His name was Daniel Brooks, and he had been waking before dawn for 2 years. The alarm on his phone went off at 4:45 every morning, though he was usually already awake by then, lying on his back in the narrow bedroom of the apartment on Caldwell Street, listening to the pipes settle and the distant sigh of the highway 3 blocks over. He would lie there for a few minutes, not moving, running through the day's logistics, the way another man might run through a prayer. Which building, which floor, which crew lead. Whether Lily had taken her medication the night before. Whether there was enough in the account to cover the follow-up appointment at the end of the month. Then he would get up, make coffee, and pack a lunch he wouldn't have time to eat. Lily was 6 years old and slept with one arm hanging off the side of her mattress, her hair a disaster, her mouth slightly open. Every morning he stood in her doorway for a moment before he left. He did not touch her, she was a light sleeper, and waking her before the sitter arrived would set off a chain of events that would cost him 20 minutes he didn't have. He just looked. Then he left. The work was not difficult. That was the part people did not understand when they offered him something approaching pity, which happened rarely because most people in the buildings he cleaned did not look at him long enough to form an opinion. The work was physically repetitive and mentally empty, and for a man who had spent 12 years with his mind running at a constant low-grade roar, the emptiness was not punishment. It was something close to relief. He was good at it in ways that were slightly unusual. He noticed things. The angle of a lamp that put strain on a person's eyes without their realizing it. The stack of papers on a desk that looked disordered, but was actually organized by a system only its owner understood. And he learned to leave those untouched. The half-finished glass of water beside a keyboard that meant someone had been there past midnight. He cataloged these details without meaning to, the way a person who grew up near water can read a river current from the surface without quite knowing when they learned to do it. He had been good at reading things his entire career. The career he no longer had. The scandal had broken on a Tuesday in November, 4 years ago. By Friday, his name was in 3 separate financial news outlets, attached to phrases like systemic negligence and catastrophic oversight failure. The actual architecture of what had happened, the pressure he had documented, the memos he had sent, the single meeting in which he had been told, clearly and without room for interpretation, to revise his findings downward, none of that had made it into the coverage. What made it in was his name and the losses. The losses were real. He did not dispute them. He disputed only the causal chain, and he had done so quietly, through proper channels, and to no effect. He had a lawyer for 8 months. Then, he did not. By the time the formal proceedings concluded, his daughter was 2 years old, her mother was gone, and the apartment on Caldwell Street was the only address he could afford without touching the fund he kept for Lily's ongoing care. A mild but chronic cardiac irregularity, not dangerous. The doctors were careful to say, not dangerous. She will live a completely normal life. But requiring monitoring, requiring medication, requiring stability. He had looked at the word stability in the discharge paperwork and felt its full weight, so he had made a decision. Not all at once. The way a person doesn't decide to hold their breath, they simply stop releasing it, and time passes, and eventually it becomes habit. He stopped fighting. He stopped explaining. He took the contract cleaning work because it paid consistently, and because no one in those buildings would ever look at him closely enough to recognize his face. He fixed Lily's broken music box with a pair of tweezers and a patience he hadn't known he possessed. He taught her that the polite thing to do when someone was busy was to wait quietly and not make yourself a disruption. He read the financial disclosures that sometimes ended up in recycling bins on the floors he cleaned, not because he was looking for them, but because his eyes moved to numbers the way other people's eyes moved to faces, and he could not make them stop. He would glance, absorb, set the paper back down, and move on. He was, by any visible measure, no one. He preferred it that way. Charlotte Sinclair had been running Sinclair Capital Group for 11 months, and she had aged approximately 4 years in the process. She had not wanted the company. That was the part she could not say out loud to anyone, because the wanting or not wanting of it had become irrelevant the morning she sat in the attorney's office and signed the transfer documents. 3 weeks after her father's funeral, the company had needed someone. The board had looked at her with a particular expression she had come to recognize. Not faith, exactly, but the calculation that she was the least risky available option. She had accepted that. She was good at accepting things she could not change, and moving forward at a pace that didn't allow for much feeling. She was in the middle of the largest acquisition the company had attempted in a decade. A commercial real estate portfolio spanning 4 cities, assembled by a consortium she had vetted thoroughly or believed she had. The numbers were strong. Her legal team had reviewed the structure. Her financial analysts had run projections that held up across 3 different modeling scenarios. The deal was scheduled to close in 6 weeks. She came back early the night she saw Daniel because she had a headache that had been sitting behind her left eye since noon, and she had decided, somewhere on the highway, that the papers on her dining table could wait until morning. She stepped off the elevator with her shoes in her hand. The delay she'd noticed in the elevator's response troubled her vaguely. It was the 2nd time this week, and she made a note to have building maintenance check the system. Then she pushed open her door and found a man on her floor, and everything else temporarily receded. They did not speak again that night. She went to bed. He finished his work and left. The 2nd time was 3 nights later. She came home to find the penthouse dim and quiet, and her dining table reorganized. Not dramatically, nothing had been moved out of place, but the stacks of documents she had left in loose, overlapping piles had been straightened, grouped, she realized, as she walked closer, by entity name. The subsidiaries of the consortium she was acquiring were now separated from the holding company filings, and the holding company filings were separated from the disclosure letters, and the disclosure letters were stacked chronologically. It took her 30 seconds to understand what she was looking at, and then another 30 seconds to understand why one of the disclosure letters was now on top when it had been buried 3 layers down. She picked it up. It was a routine filing from 11 months ago. She had read it, but she had read it in the context of the other documents around it, and in that context, a particular line in the 3rd paragraph had not registered as remarkable. Now, standing alone with it in her hands, she read that line again, and then she sat down. The figure in the 3rd paragraph was inconsistent with a figure in the fund summary she had reviewed separately. The gap was not large. It was exactly the kind of gap that got lost between departments, absorbed by rounding, explained away. But it was not explained away in any document she had. It simply existed, small and quiet, in 2 different places, pointing in 2 different directions. She called her head of analysis the next morning and asked him to recheck the fund flow structure from the beginning. She did not mention the cleaning crew. A week passed. He was on her floor every Tuesday and Friday. She started coming home earlier on those nights, making herself invisible in the hallway or in the kitchen, watching through the pass-through. He worked with his head down, and his movements economical. He did not touch the documents again. She had reorganized them into locked folders. A test she had set for herself as much as for him. He vacuumed, dusted, mopped. He replaced the flowers in the entryway with the arrangement from the supply closet. One night he paused at the elevator panel on his way out. She watched him study it for a moment. The small light that indicated response delay, the one that building maintenance had told her was cosmetic and not functionally significant. He pressed the call button twice. cocked his head at the interval between response and arrival, and then stepped inside without touching anything else. There was nothing in the gesture that could be called suspicious, but it was the gesture of someone who was checking something, and he had checked it in under 4 seconds. She knocked on the elevator door just as it was closing. "The elevator," she said. "You noticed the delay?" He looked at her through the narrowing gap. "It's a 17-second response gap on a system that should run at 8. The magnetic brake assembly probably needs servicing." A pause. "I can leave a note for building services if you'd like." The door closed. She stood in the hallway for a long time after that. His name, she found out, was Daniel Brooks. She had his information through the cleaning company's contract. She had never looked at it before. She looked at it now. Former employment history. Not listed. Prior address. A street in the financial district of a city she recognized as the location of a firm called Mercer Holloway Group, which had collapsed in spectacular and complicated fashion 4 years ago. She knew the name, Mercer Holloway. Her father had known it better. She did not sleep well that week. She went back through her files. She pulled the original coverage from the collapse, and the regulatory filings, and the independent review that had been published 8 months after the fact, the one that almost no one had paid attention to, because by then, 3 other financial stories had consumed the news cycle. She read the independent review twice, and then she sat in her office at 11 at night with the lights off, and thought about what it meant. The fund she was acquiring had 3 principals. 2 of them were names she recognized from industry events and thought nothing of. The third was a holding entity registered in a jurisdiction that required minimal disclosure. The independent review of the Mercer Holloway collapse had mentioned, in a footnote, that several assets had been quietly restructured and redistributed in the 18 months following the firm's public failure. The restructuring had moved through a holding entity in the same jurisdiction. It was not proof of anything. It was a shape, the outline of a pattern. The way a figure in a fog is not a certainty, but is not nothing either. She began finding other shapes, small ones. A wire transfer timing that was unusual but explainable. A property valuation that was aggressive but within range. An audit firm that had signed off on all 3 entities in the consortium. A firm she had not noticed because they were reputable, and she had not been looking for connections, only for errors. She was building a picture she did not yet want to see. And then, on a Friday night, she came home early again and found Daniel in her living room with a printed document in his hand. One, she recognized as a draft summary she had left on the table, not yet filed, not yet locked away. He set it down the moment he heard her. His face did not change. "You read that," she said. It was not a question. He did not answer immediately. She had learned by now that his silences were not evasions, they were calculations. The brief moment of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer. "There's a discrepancy between the asset valuation in Section 4 and the debt schedule attached in the appendix," he said finally. "The gap is about $300,000 per property across the portfolio." He paused. At that scale, across 31 properties, the total understatement is significant. Charlotte felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. "How do you know about debt schedules?" she said. He looked at her without expression. "I'm just the cleaning crew." He picked up his equipment bag and moved toward the elevator. "Stop." The word came out with more force than she intended. He stopped. "Your name is Daniel Brooks. You worked at Mercer Holloway." The silence that followed was different from the others. Longer, heavier. "I did," he said. "You were the analyst who—" She stopped herself. Who what? Who caused it? Who failed to stop it? She had read 3 different versions of the story in the past 10 days. And they did not agree on which of those things was true. "You were there," she said instead. "Yes. My father lost $11 million when Mercer Holloway went under." She said it flatly, as a fact, because that was what it was. He never recovered financially. He spent the last 2 years of his life in a legal dispute trying to recover assets he never got back. The doctors said the stress was a contributing factor. Daniel did not look away. He did not apologize. He said, "I know." Something in Charlotte's chest cracked along a fault line she hadn't known was there. "You know, I knew the collapse was coming. I documented it. I was told the documentation was inconvenient and that I should revise it. I refused. I was removed from the project and later made responsible for it." He said this without inflection. "I know that explanation means nothing to you. It wouldn't mean anything to me either, in your position." She turned away from him. She looked out at the city, the lights across the water, the particular quiet of a place that never went fully dark. She thought about her father, the way he had sat in his study in the last months, surrounded by paper, drinking too much coffee and sleeping too little, diminished in some way she had not been able to name, and now could name very clearly. "Get out," she said. He left. He did not come back the following Tuesday. The cleaning company sent a different crew member, and Charlotte spent the evening going through her acquisition documents with a sharpness that had a different quality, now less analytical, more personal, the way you look at something when you are genuinely afraid of what you might find. She found it on a Wednesday. Her head of analysis, working from the direction she had given him, had traced the fund flow back through the holding entity and found that the capital structure of the consortium was built on a foundation of recycled assets, properties that had been written down in other portfolios, reappraised upward, and contributed to this one at their new valuations. The appraisals were not fraudulent, they were real appraisals, conducted by a real firm that was not independent, though it appeared independent if you did not know where to look. The entire structure would hold as long as the real estate market in those 4 cities did not correct. If it did correct when it did, because cycles corrected, this was not a controversial forecast. The portfolio would lose close to 40% of its stated value within 18 months, and her company would own it. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her lead counsel and told him to halt all preparatory actions on the closing. He asked her why. She told him she needed another 2 weeks. The consortium's lead principal called her the next morning. He was smooth about it, concerned, collaborative, careful to frame the delay as an inconvenience rather than a breach. She listened to him and said she was sure they could work through any outstanding questions, and she ended the call and sat in her office looking at the wall. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the face of a man who had been made responsible for something he had tried to stop, who had watched the consequences move through other people's lives, like a current he had tried to redirect and failed. She thought about what it cost a person to go from that to cleaning floors. And she thought about whether that was penance or survival, and whether there was a meaningful difference. She called the cleaning company and asked for Daniel Brooks to be assigned back to her unit. He came the following Friday. She was waiting. "I need to understand what you saw in those documents," she said. "All of it. From the beginning." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his equipment bag and sat at her dining table. And for the next 3 hours, he walked her through everything, the specific mechanism of the asset recycling, the timing of the appraisals, the way the debt schedule had been structured to obscure the mismatch until after closing. He drew nothing. He wrote nothing. He spoke from memory with a precision that was not showy, but was impossible to ignore. When he finished, she asked him how he knew. "Because it's the same structure," he said, "with minor variations. The same structure that was used inside Mercer Holloway to conceal a shortfall before the firm went public. I wrote a 90-page analysis of how it worked. The analysis was classified as proprietary and sealed in the regulatory proceedings." He paused. "I still have a copy." She looked at him. "Why didn't you use it?" "I tried. For about 8 months. Something shifted briefly behind his eyes. Then I had a daughter who needed me to still be functional. And the people I was fighting had more time and more money than I did." He said it without bitterness. That was the part that stayed with her, the absence of bitterness, as though he had processed it down to its essential facts and stopped carrying the rest. "I have a daughter," she said, and then stopped, because she did not know why she had said it. He waited. "The deal is closing in 2 weeks," she said. "If I halt it formally, the consortium will claim breach and initiate litigation. The suit will be large enough to occupy my legal team for at least 2 years and damage the company's credit standing. The board will call for my resignation. The company has 412 employees." She said this slowly. The way a person names every factor in a problem they are hoping someone will tell them is simpler than it appears. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "None of that changes what happens when the market corrects." "No," she said. "It doesn't. If you have the documentation," he said carefully, "the regulatory path is available. Not fast, not clean, but available. That path requires a complainant with standing and a complete evidentiary record." She looked at him. "The analysis you wrote. The one that was sealed." He understood what she was asking. She could see him understand it the way the stillness in his face deepened, became something slightly different. She did not ask it directly. She did not have the right to. And she knew it. He said, "If I unseal that document, the regulatory body reopens my case. Everything that was resolved gets unresolved. My name goes back into the news. My daughter." He stopped. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you. I know you're not." They sat in silence. The city outside her window was doing what it always did, indifferent, glittering, going about its specific business of never quite stopping. "There are other people in the portfolio," he said finally. "Other investors. Smaller ones. The kind who put in everything they have because the numbers looked right and someone with a good suit told them it was solid." He was looking at the table, not at her. "I know what that looks like." On the other end, Charlotte didn't say anything. "My daughter has a cardiologist appointment in 3 weeks," he said. "I'd like to be there for that." "You will be," she said. She said it with a certainty she wasn't sure she had the right to offer. He looked at her, and she held the look. "I will make sure of that." He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket and took out his phone and made a call she wasn't meant to hear, stepping to the far side of the room. When he came back, he sat down again and looked at the documents on her table and said, "We're going to need your legal team." The next 11 days were unlike anything Charlotte had experienced in a year of running a company that had not given her many easy days. Daniel produced the analysis. He submitted it through counsel, which triggered a procedural review that, under the applicable regulations, required the original case record to be reopened. The consortium's principals were notified. Their response was immediate and aggressive. A pre-litigation filing intended to establish narrative advantage, characterizing Daniel as a disgruntled former employee with a pattern of unsubstantiated accusations. The filing named Charlotte as a co-conspirator in what it framed as a coordinated smear campaign against a legitimate investment vehicle. On the 4th day, Daniel was brought in for voluntary examination. Charlotte's legal team was present. The examination became non-voluntary on day 5, when the regulatory body formally reopened the Mercer Holloway proceeding, based on newly submitted evidence. Daniel's attorney, one Charlotte's firm had retained, was good and thorough, but the process had its own momentum now, and there was a period of approximately 48 hours in which Daniel was held for questioning in a conference room in a federal building, while his attorney worked through the procedural requirements for his release. Lily stayed with the neighbor downstairs, a retired woman named Mrs. Hartwell who had a dog Lily was deeply attached to. Charlotte made sure of that. She did not ask Daniel's permission because there was no time, and because she understood, without being told, that the one thing that could not be uncertain in this situation was where his daughter was and who was with her. She went to the building on the 2nd day. She was not allowed in. She sat in the lobby for 3 hours with a folder of documents she had assembled, additional corroborating material, her analysts had developed in the past week every secondary piece of evidence she could construct to support what Daniel had provided, and when his attorney came down, she handed over the folder and went home. The following morning, she went to her board meeting. She did not request permission for what she had done. She presented the analysis, the documentation, and the projected outcome of the acquisition had it proceeded. She presented the alternative outcome, including the reputational exposure of the litigation and the 2-year distraction it would create. She presented the regulatory timeline and what it meant for the company's Q2 reporting. She was precise. She was not apologetic. The board was not pleased. 3 members indicated they would formally request her resignation. She told them they had that right, and that she would consider any formal motion at the next scheduled governance meeting, at which point she intended to present the full evidentiary record in detail and allow the board to draw its own conclusions. No formal motion was submitted. On the 11th day, Daniel walked out of the federal building with his attorney at 2 in the afternoon. He stood on the sidewalk in the light and looked the same as he always looked, composed, unhurried, as though the previous 11 days had been a logistical inconvenience. Rather than the second time in 4 years, his name had been attached to a federal proceeding. Charlotte was not there. She had work to do, and she thought he might prefer not to have an audience for this particular moment. She understood that about him, or believed she did. She sent him a message that evening. 3 words. It held up. He replied the next morning, "I know, I read the filing." The case took 14 months to fully resolve. The consortium's principals were eventually named in a separate civil proceeding, brought by a group of smaller investors, exactly the kind of investors Daniel had described, the ones who had put in everything they had. The proceeding was long and not entirely satisfying in its outcome, as financial proceedings rarely are, but the assets were partially recovered. The structure was publicly documented, and the appraisal firm lost its license. Daniel's original analysis was formally entered into the regulatory record. The independent review of the Mercer Holloway collapse was amended in a supplemental filing to reflect the new evidence. His name appeared in that filing, accurately. It did not undo 4 years. It did not restore what had been lost in the interval. But it changed the official account of what had happened. And that was not nothing. It was, he thought, approximately what truth usually got you, not restoration, but correction. A line in the record that said, "This is what actually occurred." He opened a small consulting practice the following spring. He did it alone, from a rented office the size of a large closet, with a second-hand desk and a computer he'd had for 3 years. He did risk analysis for small and mid-sized firms that could not afford the larger consultancies, the kind of clients who needed someone to look carefully at the numbers and tell them the truth, without softening it for political reasons. He charged less than the market rate. He worked strange hours because he had a daughter who was in 1st grade and got out of school at 3:15 and had opinions about what snack she preferred in the afternoon. He did not advertise. He did not network in the conventional sense. Clients came to him through a slow accumulation of word of mouth, passed between people who had been told, by someone they trusted, that there was a man who would read the documents and say what he actually saw. He was careful. He was precise. He was never again told to revise his findings downward. And he had made clear, in every engagement, that this was not a service he would provide. Charlotte changed the way she ran the company. Not dramatically, she was not given to dramatic gestures, and she had always been skeptical of the kind of leadership philosophy that announced its own transformation. But she stopped making decisions based on the fear of what would happen if she admitted uncertainty. She hired a chief risk officer and gave the position actual authority. She restructured her reporting chain so that concerns could reach her without being filtered through layers of people who had learned that concerning news was unwelcome. She told her board, at the subsequent governance meeting, that the company's growth targets for the next 3 years were being revised downward to reflect a more realistic assessment of sustainable acquisition pace. 2 board members resigned. She slept better. The first time she went to Caldwell Street, it was a Saturday in the early spring, and she brought food from a Vietnamese place near her office that she had been meaning to try for months and had finally tried the week before. She did not call ahead. She wasn't sure why. She stood at the building's entrance for a moment, holding the bag, and thought about whether this was an imposition. Then she rang the bell. Daniel answered, looking like a man who had been fixing something. There was a screwdriver in his hand, and a small mechanical uncertainty in his expression that resolved, when he saw her, into something quieter. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, which was not true. He knew it was not true. He stepped back and let her in. Lily was at the kitchen table with a book and a cup of something warm. She looked up at Charlotte with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has learned that most things adults tell you are worth evaluating independently. Then she looked back at her book. "She's shy at first," Daniel said. "She's not shy," Lily said, without looking up. "She's deciding." Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest. She sat down on the floor beside the coffee table, because the chairs were occupied by what appeared to be the components of a disassembled desk lamp, and unwrapped the food containers, and said nothing. After approximately 4 minutes, Lily came and sat beside her and accepted, without comment, a container of spring rolls. They ate on the floor. Daniel joined them after he'd put the screwdriver down. The lamp, he explained to no one in particular, had a fraying connection at the base, and he'd been meaning to get to it for 2 weeks. Charlotte said she could have sent someone. He said he preferred to do it himself. She understood that. She didn't push it. After Lily had finished eating and migrated back to her book, now installed in the armchair with her feet over the armrest, in a way that seemed structurally inadvisable, Charlotte and Daniel sat against the wall with their backs to the couch. In the particular comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and don't require its continuous acknowledgement. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle that was warm and not remarkable. Daniel was looking at the lamp components on the chair. Not with frustration, with the mild, methodical gaze of a man calculating the correct next step. "Do you regret it?" Charlotte asked. She meant coming forward, putting his name back into the record. He was quiet for a moment. "No." She nodded. The afternoon held them there. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that the people who stayed quiet were the careful ones. That staying quiet was what it meant to be smart about risk. Some of them were careful," he said. "Some of them were just afraid. And you?" He considered it. "Afraid," he said. For a long time, he glanced toward Lily in the armchair, and then more afraid of something else. Charlotte looked at her hands. "My father would have—" She stopped. She didn't know how to finish it. "Would have understood this. Would have wanted this. Would have liked you," she thought, and did not say. "I know he would have been the same kind of person," Daniel said. Not a comfort exactly. Just a statement. Something he believed to be true. She looked at him. He was already looking at the lamp again. She came back the following Saturday with no particular reason, and the Saturday after that. She did not make a habit of announcing it, and he did not make a habit of acting as though it required announcement. Lily developed an expectation that the spring rolls would be from the same place, which Charlotte found she had no objection to honoring. Months passed the way good months do without dramatic punctuation. One evening, later in the season, when the light had shifted to the longer, warmer angle of early summer, Charlotte was standing at Daniel's kitchen window, looking at nothing in particular, while he replaced the rewired lamp's shade behind her. Lily was asleep. The apartment was quiet in its specific, lived-in way. "You've stopped looking for the exits," Charlotte said. She hadn't planned to say it. He paused behind her. She heard the small click of the lampshade settling into place. Then, "You noticed that." "I notice things," she said. A small echo. "I know," he said. She turned from the window. He was looking at her with the same steadiness he'd had from the beginning, the night on her floor with the broken glass, the conference room with the analysis, the sidewalk outside a federal building she had not let herself go to, because she had understood instinctively that some moments belonged to a person alone. He had always looked at her that way, as though he had already assessed the situation and was no longer surprised by it. "Don't disappear again," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The lamp came on behind him, warm and steady, throwing its light across the room in a way that reached most of the corners. Not all of them, but most.